lust, envy, greed, wrath, gluttony, sloth, and pride. The 7 deadly sins are used as a basis for a ton of characters in anime, but the most famous representation of the sins are definitely in the show's Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood and these 7 deadly sins. So in today's video, I'm going to be going over these 2 shows and how they depict the sins through their characters, as well as trying to figure out which version I tend to like more. On top of that, I'm going to be talking about the 8th deadly sin and how it's represented in each show. With all that being said though, if you do enjoy this video, be sure to leave a like, and if you're new to Excellion, consider subscribing and ringing the bell so that YouTube lets you know when I upload a new video. Naturally, I'll be talking about some of the major characters in each of these shows, and there might be some spoilers ahead. But if you're cool with that, let's get into it. So right off the bat, there's a pretty clear difference in how these characters are designed and written. In Fullmetal Alchemist, the 7 deadly sins tend to be used as a core to the homunculi who they are represented by. This is seen in how they act and are designed. However, in the 7 deadly sins, the sins act as more of a baseline for the characters. It's their greatest weakness, and in most cases, they were accused of a great crime that reflects this sin, despite there often being much more to their story. The sins are something that they try to overcome and atone for as the story goes on. But to get a sense of this difference, let's start out with gluttony and you'll see what I mean. Gluttony is the overindulgence or overconsumption of anything to the point of waste. Oftentimes it's linked with eating, specifically when it would lead to others not having enough food. However, at its core, gluttony can be broken down to selfishness and poor impulse control that leads to a detriment to others. Gluttony in Fullmetal Alchemist is easily one of the most on-the-nose representations in the series. He is a small, bald homunculus with dead white eyes, an incredibly creepy smile, and his big old belly. His childlike personality reflects the point in one's life where people are less aware of those around them. Gluttony is for the most part more kind than his siblings, however, this is more linked to his sense of innocence than anything else. At the end of the day, there's only one thing that Gluttony really loves, and that's eating. Specifically eating people. This is to the point where he often has to be paired with another homunculus in order to keep him in check. Usually it's lust, and he often asks her if he's allowed to eat someone before devouring them whole. In the 7 deadly sins, gluttony is represented by Merlin. Merlin is one of the only members of the sins, along with Meliodas, who actually committed their crime. That being said, the manga's kind of in a spot where we may find out more details about Merlin, but as of right now, we have this story. Merlin's sin comes from about 3,000 years ago. Merlin was a mage from Belialuin, and to this day remains to be extremely gluttonous. However, this isn't in the classic sense of eating or living overly lavishly. Instead, she looks to consume knowledge. She wants to gain all the information the world has to offer. Luckily, she was born with a magical ability called Infinity. This allows her to make any spell that she casts last forever, unless she actively undoes it. This powerful ability made her incredibly interesting to the King of Demons and the supreme deity of the goddesses. During the Holy War, each approached her to have her join their side, and Merlin agreed to assist whoever offered her the best gift. So the Demon King gave her all the secrets of the demon world and protection against the goddess's brainwashing. Meanwhile, the supreme deity gave her divine protection and the ability to nullify dark spells and commandments. With these gifts, she basically had a full protection from each side. So with this protection in mind, Merlin just backed out and betrayed them. She didn't really have anything to gain from either of them anymore. The Demon King and the Supreme Deity were less than excited by this and decided to destroy Belialuin and leave her as the last living mage. And by that, you should probably get what I mean when I say there's an inherent difference in how the sins are projected in Fullmetal Alchemist and the 7 deadly sins. Gluttony in Fullmetal Alchemist takes the idea of someone being obsessed with eating and cranks it up to 11, making them eat people. However, in the 7 deadly sins, Merlin is looking for something more abstract and less tangible than just eating. And more importantly, is that there's a consequence for Merlin's actions. She isn't just acting in a vacuum. The insane gluttony for knowledge actively affects the world around her, which is why the 7 deadly sins anime as a whole has a more interesting portrayal to me. Next up, let's talk about gluttony's main partner in Fullmetal Alchemist, lust. Lust is typically an intense longing, usually attributed to sexual desire. However, it can include a desire for money, power, or really anything sinful. Jumping back into Fullmetal Alchemist lust, you can probably imagine what we're going to be getting. An attractive woman in a low-cut, tight dress, heels, and black gloves who talks in a sultry tone. Now, lust is a bit of a special case among the homunculi. This is because while she definitely looks the part, she doesn't exactly act the way that you might think. She isn't really walking through Amestris and bringing people to the bone zone. Instead, she uses her sexuality as a weapon. She's not sleeping with people, but she will tease and lead them on so that she can gain information or she can get them to act in her favor. She's more of a manipulator than a lover, something which goes hand in hand with her hatred for humans. This all comes together as a perfect example during her first appearance in Lior, where she manipulates Father Cornello and causes a civil war. On the 7 deadly sins side of things, we have the doll Gowther. This character, despite having the title of lust, has neither a very masculine nor feminine design, instead riding a more androgynous line. This is because when the doll Gowther was created by the demon of the same name, he was made in the image of the demon's ex-lover. However, he was made into a boy doll so that his creator wouldn't feel lustful towards him. Being a doll, Gowther suffers from a kind of Pinocchio or Tin Man condition. He doesn't have real emotions, as he doesn't have a real heart. As such, he lusts to be able to feel and understand emotions. Of course, there was a point in which Gowther did feel something. When his demon daddy died, Gowther was given a magical heart so he could experience life. He fell in love with a woman named Nadia Leonis, however, she became very sick. She and Gowther were alone in her room one night and were talking all lovey-dovey, and then ended up sleeping together. Unfortunately, Nadia passed away during this, and Gowther began to scream. He ripped out the heart from his own chest and tried to give it to her to bring her back to life, but of course that didn't work. Gowther began screaming in horror, and when the guards showed up, they accused him of forcing himself on the princess and killing her. During this event, as I said, Gowther pulled out his heart and in doing so gave up his own emotions. As such, he has spent his life ever since trying to regain what he gave up. Both of these portrayals act in a really interesting way to subvert the normal view of what lust is. Gowther is incapable of feeling any emotions tied to his sin, while lust is outwardly everything you'd expect, but instead focuses on manipulation above everything else. And because of all this, I think this is definitely among the best examples of this list of how to adapt a concept into a character in a really creative and effective way. Next up, we have one of my favorite homunculi, and definitely one of my least favorite sins: envy. Envy is the desire to covet the traits or possessions of someone else. In Fullmetal Alchemist, envy is a homunculus that can change their voice or appearance to copy anyone they choose. Of all the homunculi, envy is most outwardly hateful towards humans, and as the name might suggest, this comes from them being envious of them. Humans have an inner strength, and they're able to build strong friendships and ties with each other. However, envy was never able to become close to the other homunculi. As a whole, envy is just a reflection of the sadness and aggression that people feel when they're jealous, as well as the embarrassment that they experience for feeling that way. This is shown when we see their true form, which is quite literally green with envy, and which takes the saying of Two-Face to a whole new level. Its counterpart here is the sin of envy, Diane. Diane, in my mind, is probably just envious of other characters who can go a whole season without getting another case of amnesia. However, canonically, Diane is a giant with a powerful sense of envy. In general, this tends to revolve around love. She's jealous of Elizabeth and throws a tantrum whenever Meliodas gets close to her, and when she sees a human couple who is married, she's jealous that she doesn't have that kind of love. And this is pretty reflective in her character. Diane hates violence and prefers to be kind and loving. This was kind of an issue when she was growing up in a battle-hardened tribe of mercenary giants, and all of this leads into her sin. When Matrona, the leader of the giants, was killed by humans, Diane was blamed for it under the false assertion that she was envious of Matrona's position. I think that the use of envy in Diane's character is probably the laziest example. It doesn't really affect her character in the same way that the other sins in the series do. There's no real consequences for her actions, and it just really comes out in her personality when she's being obtusely jealous over Meliodas. Envy, on the other hand, while being pretty straightforward, is definitely effective. Their jealousy of humans comes across in their aggression and their sadistic side, which is just about seen in everything that they do in the series. And more importantly, there's a real payoff when they have to come face to face with their jealousy. To be slothful means a person is uninclined to take action, be it on a physical or mental or spiritual level. On that note, if Diane was my least favorite sin, Sloth is definitely my least favorite homunculi. Like Gluttony, Sloth is another of those on-the-nose representations of their sin. He is a massive hulk of a monster who talks and moves slowly unless he's forced into action. Maybe I just didn't like Sloth because he didn't get so much screen time. However, even in the moments that he had, he just felt kind of uninspired. Most of his appearances just involved him complaining that he had to do work, and there wasn't really anything else tied to his personality beyond that. At least Gluttony had this weird, joyful personality that contrasted his dark behavior, but Sloth is just too one-note and one-tracked for me. On the sins side of things, we have the Fairy King, Harlequin, and he's definitely the point in which we're reaching my favorite set of sins. King was the leader and protector of the Fairy King's forest, and about 700 years ago he went to stop a group of humans from ripping off and stealing the wings of fairies. This led to a quick battle between King and a knight named Aldrich. King unfortunately lost this battle and was tossed off of a cliff. When he woke up, he had completely lost his memories, and it took nearly 700 years for him to get them back. After he finally gets these memories back, though, he does see a fire off in a human village nearby, and when he goes to save the humans, he finds his old best friend Helbram, who had been using magic to look like the man who he had thought killed King in order to betray humans and kill as many of them as possible. On top of this, in the time that King had forgotten who he was, the Fairy King's forest was attacked by a demon and burnt to the ground. Filled with guilt from turning a blind eye from both his people in need as well as not being able to stop his friend's murderous rampage, King was branded with the sin of Sloth. Now, some might say that King had no memories of his responsibilities. However, despite this, King still feels that he should have been there to make a difference, and it's almost like he's being blamed for not knowing there was a problem. Between these two representations, one is straightforward and literal, and the other is almost a philosophical issue about responsibility. Without a doubt, I like King's portrayal a million times more. Greed is the desire to possess material things beyond what you need, and both in Fullmetal Alchemist and the 7 Deadly Sins, they're easy contenders for the best characters in the series. Greed in Fullmetal Alchemist is a man who's obsessed with having everything the world has to offer, surrounding himself with luxury and beautiful women. At his core, Greed's desire to have everything comes from his inability to actually know what he wants from life. If he can't be happy with something, he'll try to be happy with everything. He's easygoing, charismatic, and narcissistic. However, he has this air about him that makes other people want to work with him, something he uses to his own benefit whenever he can. When Ed pushes against Greed's goals, explaining that wanting something too much can be harmful, Greed simply says that it doesn't matter. Everybody wants something, and that's just how the world works. He's also one of the only cases where Homunculus stands against Father, as if Father was to rule the world, Greed can't. This is still another straightforward approach to building a character on the idea of a sin. However, the personality that comes along with Greed in Fullmetal Alchemist makes up for it and makes him a much more enjoyable character instead of being bland like Sloth. Then we have Bon. Bon grew up in an abusive home with a father who would beat him in his sleep and expected him to steal food if he ever needed to eat. Eventually, he was saved by a man named Zivago, who took Bon in and taught him to steal, and would tell Bon stories of legends to keep him entertained, one of which was the story of a fountain of youth. Flash forward a few years, and Bon is in the Fairy King's forest, climbing the sacred tree to drink the fountain and gain eternal life. There's even a moment where Bon explains that he's looking for immortality because he thinks that if he lives long enough, eventually something good might happen. Don't get me wrong, Bon has no issues taking what he wants from other people whenever he wants to. However, it seems definitely more nurture than nature. He was raised needing to steal to survive, and even when he tried to steal from the Fountain of Youth, he was just looking for a moment where he could finally be happy. He wasn't really doing it maliciously, it was more out of hope. Anyways, back to the Fairy King Forest. At the top of the sacred tree, Bon meets Elaine, King's sister, and the acting protector of the forest. She throws him off the tree several times until she finally asks him to stop, and she explains that the fountain is linked to the forest's life. Bon immediately understands that the forest is more important than himself, and says that he'll stop, showing that while he was raised to be greedy, he's not beyond understanding empathy. Instead, Bon chose to live with Elaine for a short time, and they quickly fell in love. Everything was finally going great for him, until the red demon attacked and burned the forest down to the ground. The demon mortally wounded both Bon and Elaine, and when Bon asks Elaine to drink the fountain so that she can survive, she instead pretends to drink it and forces it into Bon's mouth. Bon got the immortality which he came to the forest for, but he lost the one person he ever loved, the one thing he truly wanted. Bon to me is the only perfect example of a sin and the consequences associated with it. You see his greed, you see where it came from, you see how he meets Elaine and how the greed starts to become less important to him. and you see how everything kind of falls apart. There's definitely a sadness to it, but his story arc involves him accepting and harnessing his greed so that he can eventually get Elaine back. And I think that's by far the best representation of this sin that could have been put out in this series. Pride is considered the original and most severe sin. It is considered a perversion in humanity that makes them believe that they are more like God. It's putting one's own urges, desires, wants, and whims before others, and the belief that they're right in doing so. It's hubris, selfishness, and refusing to recognize one's own faults. Pride is one of the two named homunculi in Fullmetal Alchemist. Salim Bradley acts as a young boy who is completely filled with admiration and respect for his father, King Bradley. However, when he is revealed to be Pride, his true personality comes out. Fitting to his name, Pride acts as though he is far superior to humans. He's boastful and apathetic towards others, but above all, he is arrogant and cruel. Among the homunculi, Pride is most likely to taunt and belittle his opponent. Every little detail, from the way that he looks at others to the tone in his voice, just gives off this air of someone who's looking down on people. We didn't really get a whole lot of time with Pride since he was kind of a twist later on in the story. However, despite this, I think that they really nailed the arrogant interpretation of Pride. While Salim is the more dark end of Pride, the sins gave us Big Daddy Sunshine in Escanor. Escanor is a special case, mostly because he has two personalities. He was originally a prince from the kingdom of Castello, and his brother would bully him all the time. However, one day, this bullying led to him awakening his power of sunshine. Basically, this splits Escanor's personality into two. Firstly, a scrawny, pathetic, weak version of himself who is self-conscious, cowardly, but outwardly kind towards others, which appears during the night. However, during the day, he is a massive beefcake of a mustachioed man who is unbelievably strong with a sense of self-worth and pride that is matched only by his own strength. In the latest manga arcs, we've seen both versions of Escanor go through a ton of changes. Nighttime Escanor being put into a position where he has to defend others and stand up to a powerful demon, knowing full well that he'd likely die. And daytime Escanor, on the other hand, being put in a position where he can show his friends how grateful he is for having them, and even being ready to sacrifice himself if he needs to. One version showing new confidence while the other shows humility. Again, as opposed to being a direct representation of pride, the 7 deadly sins shows us how a prideful person can grow. And the final sin, of course, is wrath, and in both cases, they're the leader of their respective groups. Wrath is a feeling of uncontrollable anger, rage, or hatred. In Fullmetal Alchemist, wrath is presented by Führer King Bradley. As far as being the representation of wrath goes, well, he's basically a king of a dictatorship at the head of a military state. He wears a military uniform, an eye patch, and has a dominating presence whenever he's on screen. Typically, Bradley is shown to be happy and friendly, however, through the entire series we get glimpses of this brutality that he's hiding. Among the homunculi, Bradley is kind of different. Just like the others, he has a Philosopher's Stone embedded in him. However, at his core, Bradley is the only homunculi to originally be a human. He was born for the specific purpose of becoming Wrath. When he was young, Father injected him with a Philosopher's Stone, an event which left Bradley unsure if he retained his own soul or if he had simply merged with the wrathful souls inside the stone. In terms of how he represents wrath itself, Bradley is an absolute monster of a fighter. In a world filled with what are essentially science wizards, Bradley surpasses just about all of them using just a sword. He's caused and manipulated wars across the continent, led a genocide, and abused his position to ensure complete control over Amestris. When it comes to the idea of a wrathful being, Bradley is king. And just like Bradley, Meliodas is usually shown to be smiling and overly friendly. However, there are always moments when he gets serious that you can feel that there's a lot more to him. Meliodas was originally the commandment of love and was the first in line to become king of the demons. However, he betrayed his clan to be with the goddess Elizabeth, and as a result, they were each cursed. Meliodas was cursed to be immortal, while Elizabeth was cursed to be continuously reincarnated and to die as soon as she remembers her time with Meliodas. Basically meaning that Meliodas had to watch the woman he loves die over and over again, with him having experienced this over 100 times at the start of the series. What's important to remember here is that Meliodas is essentially a walking nuke, and upon seeing the previous reincarnation die, he even wiped out an entire country, leaving only a crater where it stood. Meliodas, while being someone who holds a love that spans thousands of years, also holds a wrath that comes from watching that love be taken from him over 100 times. Both of these depictions are phenomenal, but if I had to choose, I think I like the deeper story that is tied to Meliodas a lot more. So when comparing the 7 deadly sins in these two stories, it's a pretty clear line. Fullmetal Alchemist tends to have more literal depictions of the sins and extends to their personality and physical appearance in a very direct way, while the 7 deadly sins, on the other hand, take these concepts and often subvert them, giving them core factors of each sin as a basis for their character, and instead making them a sort of jumping off point for the character to grow from. On top of that, making several of the characters be accused of great sins that they did not commit, yet they are still willing to try and overcome and feel responsibility for. I think this creates a really interesting dynamic that adds a lot to the cast. Now, at the start of this video, I mentioned that there is an 8th sin, and if you've watched both of these series, you've probably noticed that each group has an extra member. This isn't often referred to, but the 8th sin is typically known as the greatest sin of all. Despair. Despair is the idea that someone is damned absolutely, rejecting the concept of a forgiving God. I guess the idea is that if you don't think you can be forgiven, why would someone else forgive you? And this ties to each group's extra members being Father and Elizabeth, the two members who are likely the most important for setting the tone in the series. Father, the main antagonist of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, is a dwarf in a flask who wanted to become God. There's a whole long story as to his plan, but suffice it to say that the core part of his plan was to remove these 7 deadly sins from himself. In his mind, he could never become perfect if he held on to the faults of humanity, an action which the actual god of his world punishes him for. Elizabeth, on the other hand, begins her story in Leonis, a nation on the verge of war with a legend of 7 knights known as the 7 deadly sins who betrayed their kingdom. Despite this, to save her kingdom, she set out to gather the sins and have them help in the upcoming battle. Do you see the difference here? Father is filled with despair. He sees himself as someone who can never be perfect unless he removes the sin from his life, and in doing so, he pushes himself further from his goal. Elizabeth, on the other hand, embraces the sins, which on a less physical sense are the parts of a human being that make them human, and that leads to her kingdom's salvation. She rejects despair and instead fills herself with hope, and this extends to the rest of the cast as well. The homunculi are pulled out of Father and cast out, and they seem to spend their entire lives looking for something to make them complete. The sins, though, are embraced by Elizabeth and spend their journey trying to accept their sins and become better people despite them. The difference in the characters in this series comes down to the 8th sin. One cast is burdened by despair, while the other is bolstered by hope. Anyways, guys, that is just my perspective on how the homunculi and 7 deadly sins are built in different ways. If you disagree or you have other things to comment, let me know down below. And if you did enjoy this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more anime content. With all that being said, this has been Excellion, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.